Britain's national nightmare is over. This was a delightful thing to see this morning. GB News suspends Wootton after Fox comments. After the brief fleeting moment of joy that I felt, my first thought was, why now? Because let me tell you something. Companies don't just suddenly grow a moral compass and change something overnight. It is because for some reason the status quo has become unmanageable and untenable. But that doesn't mean real change is coming. Because lest we forget, just last week it was announced that GB News would not investigate claims against presenter Dan Wootton because none of the accusations related to work on his show. Oh, that's the line we're going with? Dan did not get suspended over allegations against him. Literally, GB News said, nah. So what happened? I'm going to show you the clip in question now. I warn you, it's absolutely disgusting. It's misogynistic, but don't just pay attention to what Lawrence Fox says. Watch Dan's face.
A single self-respecting man that would like to climb into bed with that woman, ever, who wasn't an incel, who wasn't a cucked little incel. That little woman has been fed, spoon-fed oppression day after day after day after day, starting with the lie of the gender wage gap. And she sat there and I'm going like, if I met you in a bar and that was like sentence 3, chances of me just walking away are just huge. We need powerful, strong, amazing women who make great points for themselves. We don't need these sort of feminist 4.0. They're pathetic and embarrassing. Who'd want to shag that?
Lawrence, well, look, Sorry, I'm just going to provide a touch of balance from her because she did actually respond to this earlier today, saying that she regretted her comments, but she didn't apologize. Yes. So there you go.
A brief aside. Why does Lawrence think that she's using these lines as pickup lines? Because what's truly regressive is the fact that women are only ever doing things to get the attention and approval of men. This is going to come as a shock. But not everyone wants to you, Lawrence. Dan did nothing to stop this. If anything else, he was encouraging it with his nods and his laughs and his whatever over trying to read her tweets. And here's what I kind of think happened. There's a line that a lot of these stations like a Fox News, a GB News, try to straddle. It is providing these dog whistles on issues that they know their base cares about without treading into waters where they're going to actually get backlash and get into serious trouble for what they say. Like, there is a line and Lawrence steamrolled through it. Now, to be clear, I don't think any sort of dog whistle is okay. But I'm just putting on my gross corporate billionaire hat for a minute. That sucks. Here's the fun part, and it's when we just let them eat their own. Let's go to the fallout. This is from The Guardian, quote, "It was little surprise that Fox, the darling of right-wing culture warriors, would double down on comments that even GB News deemed too offensive to let slide. But Fox's decision to turn on Dan Wootton, whom GB News has refused to investigate over allegations of historic, inappropriate sexual messaging, was more of a curveball," end quote. So that guest appearance clip from Fox happens Tuesday night. But criticism is so strong on social media that even Dan starts to backpedal. One of my favorite things is that he said, "This is not what our channel is about," which, lols, it's exactly what your channel is about. You wouldn't apologize unless things were really bad. Dan apologizes at 7:40 a.m. London time. He reiterates his regret over the exchange and said he reacted out of shock over an off-guard moment. And I will say regrettably that this can be a normal reaction. You're caught off guard, you hear something that you're not anticipating, and you don't react the way you want to in the moment, which doesn't quite work as a defense when there are text messages that prove otherwise. And originally, Lawrence tries to say, "Don't blame Dan for this, it was my words." But then an hour later, he's suspended from GB News. And Lawrence says, "I'm going to take you down with me, motherfucker." And then Fox dropped the text messages. To be clear, there are no winners here, but this is very satisfying. Fox texts Dan after the segment and says, "Making you giggle is my weekly joy." Dan replies with the laughing emojis. He then says, "You can imagine them freaking out in the gallery." And then he says, "So much fun. Kisses." So this is how Dan felt before the fire got too hot. And then Dan was also suspended. Now we're going to take a little look over what the Daily Mail had to say, because remember, Dan had a column with them and he did get suspended a few weeks ago over the Byline Times investigation. So I thought it would be interesting to see their sanitized version of events. Do you have to bleep shag in Britain? Here's an interesting line. Quote, Wootton had been condemned for appearing to laugh at Fox's comments. He didn't appear to laugh. He laughed. Like, you can't even say with confidence watching this video that he laughed. Like, that was a laugh, a giggle, a chuckle. I mean, he laughed. He didn't appear to laugh. He laughed. And then they just give a rundown of the events. They do mention at the end that last month, the publishers of Mail Online said that they had paused Wootton's freelance column for the website following historical allegations that he used a pseudonym and offered money for sexual material to colleagues, etc. Which is also kind of funny because Mail Online is part of the Daily Mail. They make it sound like it's like a completely different business. And yes, there's different editors, but it's part of the Daily Mail. It's like kind of acknowledging the elephant in the room, but also telling you, no, that's not an elephant. That is a goat that belongs to someone else. Honestly, I think Omid Scobie put it best when he said, translation, we plan to shuffle paperwork for the next few weeks and then do F all about it. Because yes, Ofcom received complaints and GB News did what they needed to do to stop the bleeding. But that doesn't mean they're going to do an internal overhaul to cut out the cancer, to cut out where this stuff is stemming from in the first place, because it's a part of their business model. They're not remorseful. They're remorseful that they got so many complaints and they don't want to have any trouble. I don't know what else Byline Times has in the tank, but the time is now to publish it. Because otherwise, mark my words, Dan will be back on GB News in a couple of weeks. They are counting on short-term memory. There has to be sustained pressure if anyone wants to keep Dan off the airways. And to be clear, I do see a future where eventually Dan does do enough that he's more of a liability than anything else and does get cut and does become a pariah. But then he just moves into podcasting, or he'll do a Twitter show like Tucker Carlson. Like this man will not go away. I don't want to compare him to Glitter because Glitter is fun and lovely and Dan is not. But he will continue to show up. I hope to have more developments and maybe a Byline Times drop to talk about soon. Stay tuned. I was going to upload that video to YouTube, and then Byline Times dropped a new investigative piece. So I decided to wait to post to YouTube, record part 2, and just splice it all together. So here is the full-fledged video of the Dan Wootton breaking news. Enjoy. Reporting live from my bed. We have breaking news into Dan Wootton from Byline Times. They said they would have more breaking news coming soon on their Twitter, and they delivered. We are going to go into what was in Byline Times' latest drop and what we can expect from them, and what it might mean for Dan, Lawrence, and GB News. The latest news from Byline Times, this is a network problem, in quotations, which means they heard it from somebody at the network. Dan Wootton suspended from GB News. Byline Times gives a summary of what exactly happened, which if you click on the comment, you can go back to my video and watch me explain the whole thing. The big news here is that Byline Times talked to people at GB News, including the fact that there was apparently a threat of staff insurrection over how Wootton, the show's executive editor, handled the segment, and the apparent mocking of the production staff, per Fox's tweets, which led to Wootton's suspension. This is what they're referring to. That basically they're making everyone working on the show freak out because of the scandalous things they're saying. Remember the time, like 10 hours before you were both suspended? Back to the article. One senior host told Byline Times that this had been, quote, inevitable. Another GB News source said that Fox and Wootton will never again appear on the channel, which I am a little bit more of a realist. I don't think we're at that point yet, but I think that Seesaw is starting to wiggle a little bit between protecting Dan and Dan being too much of a liability. Because remember, it's not about morals, it's about the bottom line. Another senior presenter said, quote, it's about time, but why only suspend Wootton? They should get rid of him for good, end quote. GB News claims that it doesn't have a toxic workplace culture. Okay. Here's an interesting tidbit. Quote, but the latest incident, which GB News insists does not reflect our values, could lead the news channel facing yet another Ofcom investigation, adding to the 11 currently active, on top of 3 others the regulator has previously upheld against the troubled network, end quote. Ofcom is where you send the complaints to in Britain when you watch something that isn't right. Recall, Ofcom got a record number of complaints against Piers Morgan and the comments he made on Good Morning Britain about Meghan Markle and her mental health, leading him to storm off the set the next day and effectively fire himself. Couldn't happen to a nicer guy. Byline Times also makes it clear that they themselves lodged a complaint to Ofcom about Dan's words against the newspaper on his show a couple of months ago. They say he wrongly characterized the paper as a hard left blog and evoked the language of a culture war. Because that's what people like Dan do. But here's another interesting tidbit. Dan is the highest paid presenter at GB News, making £600,000 a year. Which brings up a very good question. Why did he need to crowdfund through Democracy 3.0, which is owned by a man that donated money to help start GB News in the first place? And now that it appears his crowdfunding campaign has been taken down, what happens to the approximately £35,000 that's in there that was supposed to go to legal fees? Where does that money go? We don't know. Because if you look at the crowdfunding site and look in their About Us page and understands their rules, it's not clear. Nothing is clear at all. And that is probably intentional. And there seems to be widespread discontent at GB News. Byline Times says employees have painted a picture of a rudderless organization that has lost hundreds of experienced journalists in the past 2 years, driven out by presenter power. Basically, ideologues like Dan Wootton, or people willing to play that role. And I don't doubt that there are some people somewhere at GB News that want to do real journalism and good work and maybe naively thought that's what they were getting into, but my dude. Here's the biggie at the bottom, though. It says in a separate box, Byline Times is currently investigating Dan Wootton's 2 years at GB News and will be publishing our investigations in the coming weeks. Byline Times just told us what is to come. And I am willing to bet that this was part of the plan all along. Whether it was supposed to happen in this order, I do not know. Because what Byline Times has done with this investigation up to this point is they have laid the groundwork of a repetitive pattern that Dan Wootton has in the way he operates, both in his personal life and his professional life. And it's hard to imagine that all of this just suddenly stopped. He turned over a new leaf when he joined GB News. Here are my guesses. And again, this is just an opinion. I do not know what is to come. My guess is we are going to see a pattern of Dan continuing to behave the way he does and GB News protecting him. Perhaps similar to the way the Sun protected him against employees that came forward with complaints, basically paying them off so that nothing went to a public tribunal where more information would be made public, enforcing NDAs on them so that they could not discuss it. Because, and this is important, the reason that GB News gave about not investigating claims against presenter Dan Wootton is that it did not happen at their workplace. This was a problem unrelated to their channel. My guess is that Byline Times is going to lay the groundwork that proves that false. So I think one of two things is going to happen. One route is that GB News just ignores this, waits for the dust to settle, and then quietly brings Dan back. But I could see another way forward in which GB News attempts to thwart this entire investigation by firing Dan before anything else comes out. So that they can basically say, yes, we heard your problems with Dan. He is fired. He is no longer a part of the network. There is nothing wrong with the network. It's that whole idea, if Dan becomes so toxic that it could potentially hurt the entire infrastructure, then they will drop him like a hot potato. It has to get bad enough that it affects the continuation of the network and the bottom line. Again, this is breaking news from Byline Times. More to come as I receive it.